sometimes people ask me what I do for a living, and I say I work with a charity that funds research against aging. And on a good day, the reply is going to be, okay, cool, no follow-up questions, no rising eyebrows, nothing, as if the idea of being forever young and healthy wasn't any more exciting than accounting. Now, I hope there are no accountants here in the audience, but my point is that I could have it a lot worse, because the idea of life extension is very controversial. A discussion on life extension can get really heated up. Beyond being, understandably skeptical, people are flat out hostile to it. They think it's immoral, wrong, dangerous, and nearly any other negative qualifier you can imagine, and they come to this conclusion within 5 minutes of hearing about life extension for the first time. So why is this? Why the indifference and the hostility? Why isn't life extension more popular, and how can we make it more popular? Well, we might want to start by making sure people don't get the wrong idea about what we mean by life extension. And what we mean is the administration of medical treatments that address the root causes of aging. These treatments may keep us healthier for longer, postponing age-related ill health and death potentially indefinitely, and the obvious results of this are much longer health spans and lifespans. But when people think that we mean extending frailty or hooking you up to machines to forcefully keep you alive or mind uploading and stuff like that, it's only natural that they freak out, so we have to make sure to set the record straight right from the beginning. However, by itself, this is probably not going to be enough to win people over, because they're still going to ask, well, why would you want life extension? Which is exactly the same as asking, well, why wouldn't you want to get a terminal disease? And I'm fairly sure they would all understand why this is a remarkably stupid question, but to persuade them, we need to answer the first question anyway, even though, the perfect answer would be exactly because I don't want to get a terminal disease. So here are some reasons to want life extension that we can give to people. Most importantly, the goals of medicine are curing or preventing diseases, preventing or alleviating suffering, and preserving life for as long as possible. And the goals of life extension are exactly the same in the special case of older patients. So we want life extension to be able to provide truly effective medical care regardless of the patient's age, which isn't too controversial, right? Life extension would also give us the freedom to choose a longer and healthier life. And at the moment, past a certain age, we don't really have a choice to be healthier or live much longer. Without life extension technologies, this can't be done, not even in principle. If we had life extension, it would be possible, not certain, but possible, for us to remain fully healthy and live for as long as we wanted. From a moral standpoint, opposing life extension or research on it is opposing the idea that older people should be fully healthy. And worse still, a ban on life extension would effectively constitute legalized age-based discrimination against older people. We would be saying basically that once you're old enough, we'd rather you get sick and die than do something about it. On the other hand, being indifferent to life extension is akin to a crime of omission. For example, if we saw somebody badly wounded on the street, right, and we chose to just walk away and do nothing rather than help them, that would make us awful people, correct? But now, what kind of people would we be if we knew that we could do something to preserve the health and life of all the people, but chose not to? We've also got a population aging problem. In 2050, almost a quarter of the population will be at least 60, which foreshadows a looming pension crisis, a shrinking workforce that endangers the economy and makes paying all those pensions a lot harder, and spiraling expenses for geriatrics that doesn't really solve the problem. But if we had life extension to keep us alive and as healthy as young people, then we would be able to work for longer, possibly indefinitely, making retirement a choice rather than a necessity. And of course, this means that we will be able to produce wealth for longer rather than just consume it for 2 decades at the end of our lives, which is what happens today. Now, whether you'd rather die than work that long, that's a different matter altogether, but the ability to work for longer does not mean that you cannot retire ever. It only means that we need to come up with different retirement plans. Also, we wouldn't need geriatrics anymore, not in the traditional sense, so we wouldn't have to pay for it. There are also plenty of personal benefits that we would get from life extension. For example, the living long enough to see the far future, spending more time with our loved ones without becoming an emotional or financial burden on them, and the chance to accrue a lot of life experience. These are only some of the reasons to want life extension, but they should be more than enough to make it extremely popular, and yet it is not. There are several reasons why that is, the most obvious of which is skepticism. People are understandably skeptical that rejuvenation might be possible because historically, rejuvenation was the subject of plenty of myths and tales and cautionary tales and so on, but unlike aging, it was never observed in real life. Therefore, it not only goes against our everyday experience, but it also has a sort of mythical feel to it. In the past, people did genuinely try to achieve rejuvenation, but their attempts involved things like, drinking mercury, injecting themselves with extracts from dog testicles, and none of these worked very well. Also, there have been, let's just say, crafty people who didn't really try to create the elixir of youth, but managed to sell it anyway. And in contrast, actual scientific understanding of the root causes of aging and what we could do to prevent it has made significant progress only very recently. So virtually everyone has had plenty of time to internalize the preconception that aging is an immutable phenomenon and rejuvenation is either a pipe dream or the stuff of quacks, while most haven't even heard about the actual science. And on top of that, we've all learned to be resigned to aging, and skepticism is a fantastic way to protect ourselves from a potential letdown in this sense. To overcome skepticism, we need to explain how aging happens and how we can prevent it. Therefore, we ourselves need to understand these things well enough to make other people understand them. If you're a researcher, you don't have this problem, you surely understand it reasonably well, better than most. Anyway, a high-level overview is generally enough. You don't need to go into very technical detail that most people wouldn't really care about, but it's important to be able to provide plenty of references to studies and researchers who say that life extension is feasible, and that we're not talking dog testicle shots anymore. And in the process, we should avoid red flags such, calling life extension immortality when they are two different things, endorsing supplements of dubious efficacy, or associating with people who don't quite follow the scientific method and stuff like that. Then there is the problem of misconceptions, that these widely held beliefs about life extension and aging that are actually false, like these ones. This chart was extrapolated from a 2009 study about public perceptions on life extension, and it's very interesting to note how a whopping 50% of the misconceptions was the belief that life extension would extend the time of decrepitude at the end of life, even though the researchers had explained very clearly to the interviewees that the idea was to postpone aging to extend health and live to, say, 150. This just goes to show that many people out there can't even imagine that something could be done against aging. Why do people even fall for misconceptions? Well, because they sound intuitive, and some of them have been hammered on for centuries in art and literature in the media, to the point that they have become conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom is more likely to be perpetuated, not challenged. Some misconceptions, in particular, like, the idea that life extension is about the rich wanting to live forever while children in Africa are starving, can really push people's buttons because the current trend is to be constantly looking for something to be outraged by, especially on social media. I mean, if you mention life extension on Facebook, they're gonna bite your head clean off. So there you have it. Also, believing in misconceptions is a lot easier than digging out facts, and it allows for an easy way out of an unpleasant conversation like what about aging and death can be. You can just say that, I think nature knows best. You will get a bunch of approving nods and the discussion will just die out. So misconceptions need dispelling, and to do it, we must be familiar with them and what's behind them, like logical fallacies, cognitive biases, stereotypes, incorrect or incomplete information, or simply the fact that the person had never thought about the specific issue before. I can point you to resources after the talk if you need them, but the good thing about misconceptions is that they're generally easy to deal with. All it takes to expose them is just logical reasoning, and in some cases showing people data that is generally easy to find. Then there are concerns about grave social or environmental problems that people think would be caused by life extension, some of which are again shown in the pie chart that is extrapolated from the very same paper as before. And nearly 75% of the concerns expressed were about overpopulation, which is a hint that this is a great concern where we can start addressing concerns in general. Now, these problems might happen, they're not impossible, but people often jump the gun and they assume they are granted to happen. One possible reason is that avoiding change is a somewhat valid evolutionary strategy because big changes might endanger survival, so it makes sense to be wired to fear them and look for reasons to avoid them. Also, just like misconceptions, overpopulation, dystopias, immortal dictators, and so on are intuitive conclusions to get to, while it's much harder to look into the data to see if these problems are really as inevitable and unsolvable as they sound. Additionally, some of these problems already do happen on smaller scales. For example, unequal access to medical care, that's an example, and it's easy to believe that life extension will only exacerbate these problems further. It's also easy to overestimate the magnitude of potential problems and underestimate our ability to solve them, not to mention a generalized refusal to acknowledge the fact that to solve large problems, you need incremental steps. For example, poverty has not been eradicated yet, but a lot of people focus on this fact that it hasn't been eradicated, while disregarding the fact that it has been steadily decreasing for the past 30 years. Also, concerns about social injustice or global harm are very predominant when it comes to discussing life extension, and this leads some people to think that they are doing good by opposing life extension, even to the point of serious overreaction. So in short, fears that life extension might break society, make the world a worse place to live in, can shut down rationality entirely, which leads to a preference for maintaining the status quo rather than taking any risk, regardless of the specific likelihood or any cost-benefit analysis. Now, concerns need to be directly addressed with facts. For example, the overpopulation concern can be addressed by noting that richer countries are reproducing below replacement level, and population growth is driven by what? By a lack of education and poverty. There is also a paper by Leonid Gavrilov and Natalia Gavrilova about the expected demographics effect of life extension. Environmental concerns can be addressed by talking about upcoming technologies like say, nuclear fusion or artificial meat, which can help us sustain a larger population with smaller environmental impact, and arguments to respond to concerns of immortal dictators, cultural stagnation, financial concerns even can be done. There are arguments to address these, but most of all, we must remind the public that every second someone dies of aging, normally after decades of increasing disability, and this is a much greater toll than anything that might be caused by solving this problem. Beyond answering concerns and questions, reaching out to authorities to let them know that life extension is on its way might be another option. It might be possible to start discussing how to best prepare for life extension and maybe take measures to ensure equal access. This kind of dialogue might help mitigate people's fears, but it would require A, the endorsement of credible scientists, and B, careful consideration, because at this point it might be too early. Why bother addressing these concerns? simply, not just for the sake of winning an argument about overpopulation, but rather because if we have good data at hand, we can either show that a certain concern is unlikely, a certain problem is unlikely to materialize, or we can use the data to help us find solutions to it. If people are confident that we're taking their concerns seriously and that there are solutions in the works, they might become more supportive, which is why it might be a good idea to partner with researchers to carry out studies to specifically assess the possible ramifications of life extension. And in general, if we show people that we care about maximizing benefits while minimizing drawbacks for everyone, then life extensionists might get a better reputation than that of rich weirdos attempting to live forever and everyone become immortal even at everyone else's expense. And of course, a better reputation would mean that we would have more support and an easier time getting the job done. Anyway, misconceptions and concerns and skepticism are not the only culprits here, because if life extension is not popular, it's also become some issues within the advocacy world as well. For example, activists are far fewer than inactivists. There's people who are in favor of life extension, but don't really engage in advocacy. And it would be beneficial if more of these passive supporters became active for an obvious reason. The more that we are, the greater the reach that we will have, but also because different people in general will have different advocacy styles that may be more appealing to audiences that would otherwise be unreachable. Also, fresh points of view on the same issues might make for more effective advocacy, and advocates with different approaches should still work together within the same organizations, because the unfortunately common tendency to go solo that is common in this field is generally a recipe for burnout, and we should all try to avoid that. It's much better not to go alone. Better not to go alone because you burn out. Rather, cooperating in larger networks may allow us to do more things and more effectively. And in general, collaborations between organizations, researchers, advocates may allow us to carry out larger scope initiatives. One final note about advocacy is that there are some would-be advocates who take the wrong approach and put their listeners on the defensive. When they are faced with objections, rather than explaining things properly, they become angry or contemptuous, and this, of course, fails to convince anyone. It goes without saying we should never, ever do that, but I'm sure this piece of advice is entirely redundant for the people who are present. There is also a couple of open questions for us to consider. The first is that life extension is a radical message, let's face it, even in its mildest forms, because it challenges several well-ingrained ideas about human life. So how can we convince people to abandon the old status quo in favor of a new status quo of life extension, particularly when unhealthy habits are trendier than healthy ones? Sacrificing some health for the sake of enjoyment is, seen as an acceptable compromise. Some people even say that they don't mind to be sick in old age. They are content with the norm, even if it leads to terminal illness. And it's really hard to sell life extension to people who care this little about health. And it does not help that yet other people attempt to just reframe aging as something positive. There's this common suggestion of reframing that all there is to do beyond things like providing better services for the old is just to change our attitude towards older people, like make friends who are significantly older or younger think of aging as an opportunity rather than a challenge, whatever that's supposed to mean, and things like that. And this is a narrative that completely ignores the causal link between aging and age-related diseases, and moreover reinforces the idea that there isn't anything concrete to be done about aging. As long as we see it the right way, everything is going to be just fine. And this is the exact opposite of the kind of call to action we are making, and we need to be able to respond to this. So, in short, life extension isn't yet as popular as it deserves to be, mainly because of issues with our audience and as well with the advocacy efforts themselves, all of which can be fixed if we put enough effort into them. Humanity has completed hard challenges before. We can do this one as well. So that's about all I wanted to share with you. You can reach us out through the addresses you see on the screen, Thank you very much for your attention.